So can I get you to say your name and your full title, just so I don't mess up?
Okay, I'm Clyde Hertzman. I'm the director of the Human Early Learning Partnership at the University of British Columbia, and I'm also Canada Research Chair in Population Health and Human Development.
So can you tell, I'm going to say Helga and your viewers, can you tell Helga and your viewers what will your presentation be about?
Presentation is going to be about lessons we've learned about how the early child development works in Canadian society, following about 15 years of research. So I'm going to summarize some lessons that I think could be useful for the Child and Youth Strategy Group here in planning the Child and Youth Strategy for Nova Scotia.
Okay. You said you're from, oh sorry.
Excuse me, sorry.
We can edit.
Taping?
Yeah. It's okay. Magic of editing. Magic of editing. It's all right.
I thought you were talking.
Nope. Oh, I lost my train of thought there.
Yes. So you asked me the question about what the point of the presentation is.
Can you touch on some of the highlights that you'll mostly be focusing on?
Okay, the highlights. Well, I'm going to be talking about how the early years last a lifetime and how they influence health, well-being, learning, and behavior across the rest of the life course. I'm going to be talking about how in those parts of the country where we've been monitoring early child development at the community level, we see huge differences in the state of children's development by the time they reach school age. More than 10-fold, more than 15-fold differences in the fraction of kids who start school vulnerable in their development behind where we'd like them to be. And now that Nova Scotia is starting to do the same kind of monitoring, it's going to see probably similar patterns. I'm going to talk about what we can learn from those data, particularly what both governments and communities can learn about how to work together to improve children's development. And I'm also going to get a bit sciencey, and I'm going to talk about how the early years actually influence the whole way in which our genes function and the new biology of early child development as a basic science of understanding why all this stuff is important. And I'm going to finish talking about the fact that Canada doesn't invest nearly as much as it should in the early years. So that more or less covers it.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
That was certainly long enough.
Be a bit embarrassing, particularly when they've pulled it off the web and gotten something that's 10 years out of date. But that was very lovely, and it's very gratifying to hear what you're saying about the OECD. I mean, I've never actually worked for the OECD, so maybe they don't know what I'm like up close. Anyway, I've called this talk "Lessons from 15 Years of Research on the Early Years." It's not going to be pedantic in the sense that it isn't all lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, but there are a number of things that I think are big ideas that I've put throughout this. Before I start, though, I do want to point out and recognize that we are coming very close to the anniversary of the death of my mentor, who was Dr. Fraser Mustard. And Fraser, you know, among his many other achievements, was the one who kind of pioneered the kind of thing that I'm doing, which is taking the science and turning the science into something that communities can use, right? And so, as you know, Fraser bequeathed this province one of his sons, and we had dinner tonight, and we were talking about that and remembering how, you know, Fraser was really the one who sort of, you know, set this kind of path going. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure, actually, to be here. Really, I've been back and forth to this province about 4 or 5 times doing presentations over the last decade or so, and it's always been warm, and it's always been very, very fulfilling. So, on we go. The first lesson that I want to lay out here is something that has to do with a reality behind rhetoric. So we often hear phrases like, the early years last a lifetime, right? But I'm here to say that that's not just a kind of a truism, that is an empirically demonstrated reality. And what I mean by that is, over the years, people have been doing what we call birth cohort studies. So empaneling groups of children at the time of birth, or even in the 2nd or 3rd trimester of pregnancy, and then following them years and decades into the future. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 decades into the future. And so we have direct evidence on the contribution of early experiences and the state of children's development by the time they reach school age on health, well-being, learning, and behavior on the balance of the life course. And so we can show quite easily now that by the end of the second decade of life, by the end of the teens, early childhood is exerting an influence on school failure, unwanted teenage pregnancy rates, and early criminality, independently of the things that come afterwards. Which is not to say that the things come afterwards don't matter, but it's to say that the contribution of the early years is there regardless of what comes after, right? So it's important, and it contributes in an independent way. By the third and fourth decades of life, the early years are contributing to things like obesity, elevated blood pressure, depression, and other mental health problems. And as you can imagine, with the criminality and the depression down here, the idea now of taking a life course type approach to addictions and mental health and so forth is very much fits with what we're understanding about how the early years influence the balance of the life course. By the fifth and sixth decades of life, the early years are making an independent contribution to heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic diseases of one sort or another. And then later on in life, now that I'm 59, I'm going to edit this slide, you can see that the early years are still, after all these decades, contributing, for instance, to the rate of memory loss and to the rate at which various organs in the body decline physiologically. So when we say the early years last a lifetime, we mean it literally. We mean it, that they have an independent contribution right across those things. So that's lesson number one, which is part of the reason why the work that you're doing is very, very important, because it sticks. The second point I want to make is that our understanding of the nature of humans, that is to say the understanding of human biology and the significance of early development, is changing. Now, I'm going to give you factoids that go along with this throughout the presentation, not all clumped together, because I want to use this as an opportunity to pry open a number of issues. But just to start off with, we now have out there a concept of what's called biological embedding. Biological embedding was thought up as a hypothesis about 15 years ago, but has now become a reality. And we say then that biological embedding occurs when, first, experience gets under the skin and alters human biodevelopment. So what the heck do I mean by all of those words? What I mean is that we can now measure and show that early experience influences the way in which our brain gets shaped, the way in which our stress response pathways work, the way in which our body responds in a variety of circumstances. And it does so in the following ways. That systematic differences in experience in different social environment lead to different biodevelopmental states. Now by that, I don't only mean that children that grow up in extreme poverty, extreme abuse, extreme neglect have a different deal. What I mean is that if you look across a region like, Pictou County or Truro or something like that, and look at children growing up in different walks of life, that those differences on average daily living conditions among poor, working class, middle class, upper class, different ethnic groups, etc., is sufficient to create different biodevelopmental states that will last the balance of a lifetime. So it's not just about the extremes, it's about the day-to-day, as it were. And then the final piece is that these differences can be shown to be stable and long-term, so that they can influence health, well-being, learning, and behavior over the life course. And this idea of what makes them stable and long-term, I'm going to come back to later on. And anyway, what we've been working with now is a kind of an archaeology metaphor. So the idea that in order to understand biological embedding, you have to drill down and understand what's happening, at the level of the whole child, and then what's happening in the key organs such as the brain, what's happening at the level of the cell, and finally what's happening at the level of gene function. And it is what we've learned in the last 5 years or so about what's going on at gene function level that has made a huge difference in the credibility of this whole endeavor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk at the top level and at the bottom level. I'll say a few things about these things here, but you know, this is an evening presentation and enough's enough already. So I'm going to talk at the top and the bottom. So what I want you to start off with is an understanding of the things that occur early on in life. So early on in life, from pregnancy through till school age, there is more going on in terms of the sculpting of the brain than at any other time. So what each of these lines is showing you is regions of the brain that relate to different competencies that are going through sensitive periods. And the sensitive periods cover the upswing and the downswing, in the sense that the upswing is about brain cell to brain cell connections being made according to experience. And the down has got to do with irrelevant connections being sculpted away. And all of that, the creating of the connections and the sculpting away of the irrelevant ones, is all part of the sensitive period process. And when we say sensitive periods, we mean periods in which the developing child is sensitive to the environments of stimulation, support, nurturance, and participation that they're growing up in. So it's a period of disproportionate environmental sensitivity. And you can see there's a very dense network of these things here that go on early on in life. Some of them are continuing on later on, and more complex and abstract kind of competencies build later on top of these things. But just to give you an idea of some of the things that are at stake, you can see there, for instance, the white line is the line of the development of the visual systems. Well, key here is early on in life, if you're growing up in an environment where you have a consistent set of human faces up close at your focal length, which is about breast to face length, you will imprint the human face as the self. So connections will occur between the visual pathways and affiliative pathways that tell you that you belong with this species. And further, you will start to be able to decode the social and emotional information that is contained within the face. In other words, the smile, the frown, the crinkling of the eyes, and so forth. And in order to understand what that stuff means and understand how to be socialized by your peers, these things have to develop as stimulation within key pathways. Kids who do not get those opportunities early on do not imprint the self to the same degree and do not get the same sense that facial expressions tell them something about where they stand, right? And so, you know, the overly independent, neglected child early on in life looks interesting, but that, you know, that over-independence early on has got to do with a limited sense of the belongingness that comes from the creation of those circuits. And many of us know what that leads to in terms of risks when kids reach teenage and so forth. So that's one. Another, the language line there. You notice it's high and prolonged. And of course, language keeps developing for a long period of time. But in the early years, what we now know by direct study and observation is that children's receptive language and their expressive language go up as a straight dose response with the richness of the language environment that they're growing up in. By which I mean the number of words that are spoken directly to them per unit time, the complexity of the sentences that are spoken to them, whether or not anybody asks them questions or not, whether or not anybody gets down at eye level to meet them eye to eye when they're talking to them, so that they're providing them with this as well as that, whether or not they're read stories and so forth, right? That all of that is going into the brain and forcing development, such that what we see across North America is that the child who's reached school age with the most language spoken directly to them has heard 30 million more words spoken than the child who's heard the least. And so when two kids arrive at school and the teacher says, how was your day yesterday? For one child, that is an easy thing. They've got the circuitry set up that allows them to model some form of knowledge expertise so that you can answer a question. For the other child, it's like, the Larson cartoon about what the man says, what the dog hears. Blah, 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 blah. Because all they've ever had is 1 or 2 or 3 word interrogatives thrown at them, maybe with a slap at the same time. But the idea of actually parsing, a 10-word sentence spoken in normal tone of voice, which is calling upon them to model expertise in something, even if it's only about how they're doing right at the moment, is not established itself. And imagining that that child can do that is sort of like imagining that we tie a kid into a crib for the first 5 years of life, then untie them and say, go ahead, run. Every other kid your age can run. And then we treat it as a moral problem when they can't, right? So you see what I'm trying to say here. Also, and a very important one, by 3 or 4 years of age, circuits are establishing themselves between these deep affiliative structures in the midbrain that have got to do with attachment and belonging to what we call the executive function centers in the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex and the executive function centers actually develop right through into the 3rd decade of life. But by age 3 or 4, what's already happened is a basic form of decision making has established itself based on the cues that these kids have had in their intimate environments growing up. So, generally speaking, those kids who have grown up in fairly calm, predictable environments are developing the capacity to do focused attention. That is to say that the signals that are going from the affiliative structures to the executive function centers are saying you are safe, you are secure, focus on the thing that is in front of you and do it. So, you know, you give them something to color, they'll sit there and they'll color and they'll ignore everything else. The other kids who have grown up under threatening, unpredictable, chaotic environments, they have adapted equally as efficiently to that, right? So the signals are going, watch out, watch out, watch out, and they are watching out. So you try to get them to do something that is the kind of thing that we expect in the knowledge economy, you know, to block it all out and pay attention. That is not easy for them to do. That in fact what happens is that they've got their ear to the ground and they're watching, right? And so we've got this now. We've got, you know, neurobiology studies that show how this works, right? So that by kindergarten age, we have biological embedding of the capacity to understand if you belong, the sense of whether or not your environment is fundamentally threatening unless proven otherwise, the capacity to decode complex sentences, etc. And there are many, many other stories I can talk about. Those things go on in the early years. And so we want to ask ourselves why it is we continue to think about the early years as a place where we make limited public investment. Now what I want to suggest to you though is that the model you need to think about is a grand interaction between the developing child, illustrated here to suggest that the developing child has all these windows of opportunity that are opening and closing on a strategic basis. Interactions then between the child and the conditions they meet in the intimate realm, and then indirectly at the level of the communities they're growing up in, the regions that those communities are in, etc., and on a non-geographic basis in the communities of identity that their families have. And so you can imagine, at each level, at the level of the family, there are clearly things that are going on that are very directly relating to children's development. But even at the level of the residential area, by age 3 and 4, things like neighborhood safety, cohesion around children, socioeconomic mix are making a difference. And on the socioeconomic mix side, we see very clearly in Canada that if you come from a fairly vulnerable family, you're better off in a mixed neighborhood than you are in a ghettoized neighborhood. So, you know, I was gratified to hear this morning that there is real talk now about non-market housing being done in a mixed way rather than in a ghettoized way. And so it goes up the line. And so I want you to be thinking about that, the idea that there is this interaction going on that is driving children's development. So anyway, with that as the background then, let's talk about the archaeology of the surface, right? And here, it's a question of what we understand about patterns of development across whole children, right? And this is where work that's been done in the rest of the country, that's been done on a smaller scale in Nova Scotia, becomes very important. And I'm very glad to hear that Nova Scotia now is joining the Pan-Canadian program in a full way. And so what we do is, we start with, if I could just go back to this idea here, of that set of influences that I talked about before, and then when you add the early child development programs and services onto those environments, you get an emergent property. And the emergent property of these interactions then is the state of children's development by the time they reach school age. And we assess that state of development using the Early Development Instrument, or EDI. And so the EDI is a population-based measure that gives you, first and foremost, a backward look by saying that the state of development of children in this community reflect the quality of experiences that they've had up until that time. And then it gives you the forward look in that it says, school system, these are the challenges that you're going to have to face, because kids who come out vulnerable on the EDI have more difficulty getting out of school what we want them to get out of school. So yeah, just to say then, that the EDI is collected in February of the kindergarten year when teachers know the children well enough to be able to say things about them. It's a checklist with 104 items on it that takes about 20 minutes for the teachers to fill out on each child. It has information on their physical development, their social and emotional development, their language and cognitive development, and their communication skills. So it covers 5 scales that in turn cover the broad domains of development, the physical, the social, emotional, and the language and cognitive, that have a lifelong impact on health, well-being, learning, and behavior. And also, if you read the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we cover, using that, the so-called evolving capacities of the child in it. So it has a lot going for it. Incidentally, too, you should know, now that the province is investing more heavily in it, that the EDI is the world's best evaluated developmental tool on the population level, that we have now put 36 papers into the literature describing its characteristics as a valid and reliable tool. But it is based, this is important, on the kindergarten teachers understanding the children in relation to other children. So what we do then, and once you've done the whole province, you'll be able to get involved with this program, is map children out according to the neighborhoods where they grew up. I mean, it's difficult because some kids are transient, but we use the neighborhood of residence at kindergarten age to define that, and that's how we bookkeep the kids, right? Why? Because we're interested in the quality of experiences that kids have had in families nested in communities as our primary look. And our shorthand that we use is vulnerable on 1 or more scales. So as you remember, I said there were 5 scales of the EDI. Each scale, when the kindergarten teacher's job is to say, does the kid do this, does the kid do that, etc., etc. And then the data goes to McMaster or to us, and it is scored. Each of the scales, which has about 20-25 items on it, is scored 0 to 10, and for each of those scales there is a cutoff between 0 and 10, which is said to be the vulnerability cutoff. In other words, the cutoff below which we're saying the children are vulnerable in their development, in the sense that they will probably have more difficulty over time. So for instance, on the physical scale, a profile of a child who's vulnerable is one who doesn't yet have enough muscle coordination to be able to hold a pen or pencil. On the emotional scale, it would be a child who is either physically aggressive or relationally aggressive, in the sense of creating little cliques and gangs, etc. On the language and cognitive, it would be a child who doesn't know their way around a picture book or know any letter or number facts coming into school. On the communication scale, it would be a child who, despite being English as a first language, has trouble understanding and expressing themselves in the language of instruction of the classroom. And then what we do is we map out the fraction of children who are vulnerable on 1 or more scales. And so what you have here is a map of southwestern British Columbia with a population base of about 3 million there, divided into neighborhoods in the urban areas. That's Victoria and Vancouver sticking out there. And then in the more rural areas, divided into larger geographic areas that represent hamlets or villages or whatever, where we have, usually a minimum of 40 or 50 kindergarten children there. And so you can see from this is that there are some areas that are in dark green where the vulnerability rate is 4 to 20%. And then it goes up to the light green, the yellow, the light reddish brown, to the dark red, where the vulnerability rates go from 35 all the way up to 68%. Which is pretty stunning, if you think about it. When we first started doing this work a dozen years ago, we were expecting neighborhood differences. And we were expecting them to be on the 2- to 3-fold range, something like that. But instead, look at that, 17-fold range across neighborhoods. And if you go east from there to southern Manitoba, you see the full range of colors illustrated there. Southern Ontario, where about 1/3 of the people in the country live, same thing there. Ile de Montreal, same thing there, right? And these maps come off our Pan-Canadian monitoring platform. And so my hope is that when you complete population-based EDI here in Nova Scotia, your data too, through McMaster, will come onto our national platform and we'll be able to bring you into the Pan-Canadian dialogue we've been having and to start to learn together from these things. Anyway, this process of mapping EDI at the population level has been tremendously valuable in terms of learning things and also creating new sources of power for local communities when the data is made available in user-friendly ways like this. And that's very important, that this data not be collected and hidden. So what do the maps reveal? First, the absolutely huge local area differences in the proportion of children who are vulnerable on their development by the time they reach school age. So imagine this, we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Theoretically, although the data has questions about it, one of the most educationally successful countries of the world. And yet, we have neighborhoods in this country where more than half of the kids start school vulnerable in their development. Now keep in mind, at birth and around birth, no more than 3 to 4% of kids have got a biological limitation on their vulnerability. And yet, in a province like British Columbia, by school age, on average, about 30% of the kids are vulnerable. So there's been a 7-fold increase from the time of birth to the time that kids reach school age, right? Which is really remarkable. Second point is the process of mapping out by neighborhood across the country has allowed us to work out in a very responsible way what avoidable vulnerability rates are. Because you could ask, you see these kind of variations in, well, how much of it can you change? Well, the answer seems to be that any vulnerability beyond 10% is surplus vulnerability. Why do I say that? Well, one line of reasoning is this, that we've mapped out over 2,000 neighborhoods in the country, and in 3 of the provinces, we've mapped them out multiple times. And you can see that we've got examples of urban neighborhoods, of rural neighborhoods, of ethnically homogeneous neighborhoods, of ethnically heterogeneous neighborhoods, of privileged neighborhoods, of not so privileged neighborhoods that have all reached less than 10%. And so it's a very standard public health gag to say that if it's happened and it's not a fluke, then it's possible and therefore it's your target, right? So the fact that Finland and Sweden have infant mortality rates of 2.3 per thousand means that Canada's rate of 5 is still double what it should be. Right? It's that 10% vulnerability is still 2.5 to 3 times the vulnerability rate you'd predict based on biological factors alone. So there's a lot of room for human variation in there. And so that's what we've been saying. And what it shows then in a province like British Columbia, and I'm prepared to bet a month's salary it's going to show the same thing here, that when you divide Nova Scotia up into neighborhoods, that each wave, at first until we make progress, over 90% of neighborhoods will have some level of surplus vulnerability. So vulnerability is an issue for everybody in that sense. Now having said that, one of the other things we've done is worked very hard at looking at the relationship between the socioeconomic characteristics of neighborhoods and the rates of early development. Why? Because we know that by the time kids reach school age, if you look at the income, education, occupational status of the families, that they are associated with the children's development. That is to say, as you go from the top end of the income, education, occupation spectrum to the bottom, the fraction of vulnerable children go up. And it's the same when you organize the data by neighborhoods. And so across Canada, you build a model of socioeconomic context from census variables and so forth. What you find is that about half of the neighborhood to neighborhood variation across the country is associated with socioeconomic circumstances. But that also means that half of it isn't. And for service providers, the half that isn't is probably more amenable to manipulation than other things. So for instance, as an example, on average, without intervention, families that have more education will have more verbal exchange and do more reading with their kids than families that don't. But there's no rule of nature that says that, right? It's a question of helping families that have less education understand some of the tacit things that other families understand. You know, it's that kind of thing, right? So a lot of what we've been interested in then is neighborhoods and communities that are doing better than you'd predict based on socioeconomic status, so we can learn from them. We can learn what the actually existing principles are in local communities that allow that to happen. And so the data is very, very useful for setting up the study of why are some communities doing better than you would predict while others are doing as or worse than you'd predict. And part of the reason to expand the platform across the whole country is that we increase the number of comparisons that we can make that we can learn from. So Halifax, whether it knows it or not, wants to learn from Victoria. Why? Because they're as close to each other as peer cities as you can get. They're almost the same size, they're government towns, they even by the seaside. The thing that's interesting in Victoria, compared to Vancouver, which is not a government town, is that the amount to which socioeconomic neighborhood differences explain EDI differences in Victoria is much less than it is in Vancouver. So in Vancouver, neighborhood SES explains in a statistical sense about 70% of the differences in vulnerability, whereas in Victoria it's only about 20%, right? And that difference makes a difference to Victoria. So Victoria's overall vulnerability rate is about 10% lower than it is in Vancouver, right? So we want to understand that, right? But in order to understand that, we need to have a number of comparator places that we can compare to try to figure out what's going on, right? So that right off the bat, there are some really, really interesting opportunities to understand how communities produce or undermine the state of children's development. Another thing is, with multiple ways of this data, we can start to see change over time. Generally speaking, across the country, the story is lousy. That is to say, in the three provinces, BC, Manitoba, and Ontario, where we've got multiple waves of data over the last decade, what we've been tending to see is vulnerability rates going up way more often than going down. The reason for that seems to be that the distal factors, the socioeconomic conditions under which families are living, the number of hours per year they have to put into the labor market, etc., are declining. And even though things have been started to be done at the local level, it's been those broader things that have been defeating the narrower things. For example, between 1996 and 2006, the number of hours that an average family had to put into the labor market in Canada in order to meet a given standard of living went up by 300 hours, right? Those are hours not between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Those are hours taken out of family time, basically. So that's one example of that. And Paul Kershaw, my colleague who's been through here, has a wonderful presentation where he lays out just completely how, in effect, the generation that is baby boomers and beyond have gained from the rollout of the Canadian welfare state, whereas the drawbridge has, in effect, been brought up on that other group there. And the investments are not there to allow them to deal with the time and the role conflicts, etc., that they've got, which we'll come back to. But the change over time, once again, also allows us to find the good news stories. So it allows us to find those communities, like the community of Revelstoke in BC, which we always talk about, which started off with a vulnerability rate of about 23%. It formed a strong intersectoral coalition with strong leadership coming from the schools, the education, childcare, the libraries, the municipal sector, the economic sector, and managed to drop the vulnerability rate for the next 3 waves of the EDI below 10%. So 3 times in a row, right? Wonderful example showing the strength of strong intersectoral local communities working, thinking actively about EDI outcomes, breaking down barriers of access, and so forth. And then finally, the maps reveal the rationale for what I'm going to call proportionate universality. I'm sorry for the stupid name. I didn't think it up. Sir Michael Marmot thought it up. Guess you get made a peer for thinking up stupid names like this. But anyway, proportionate universality is a tactical idea that's designed to get us out of the endless toothache of targeted versus universal. And it applies in spades in this situation because of the epidemiology of early development. So I'm going to walk you through this stuff, right? So here is actual data from one of the waves of the EDI in British Columbia. So each of the dots there represents one of the 400-odd neighborhoods in the province, which according to their socioeconomic status go from the most advantaged to the least advantaged, and their EDI vulnerability rates going from low to high. And as you can see, this is the pattern, right? There is the 50% that is explained by socioeconomic status in a statistical way, and all the dots that are off that line are either doing better, lower vulnerability for a given SES, or worse. So you see what I'm saying there? So that is the notion of a gradient then, right? That there are no thresholds, no cut points. It just gradually goes up. So what happens when you have gradients? Well, you have this interesting issue that if you think of each of these little people here then as being either an individual or community, as you go from this end to that end, a higher proportion of the children living in these communities are vulnerable. And even our color coding with the green through to the reddish brown color has a tendency to draw your attention to this end, right? But because of how the population is distributed, most vulnerable children live, in fact, in the more populous middle class areas, right? So community in and community out, what you're going to find is that the children, most of the vulnerable children, numerically are spread across the middle class neighborhoods that are most populous at a rate of about 20 to 30%. And that these areas here might have 40 to 60% vulnerability, but they make up a minority of the children, right? So gradients create this numbers game, that where the relative risk is highest is not where the attributable numbers are the largest, right? So in order to really illustrate this, okay, so yeah, first thing then is, our strategy ought to be to bring vulnerability down, heading towards that 10% threshold everywhere, right? So that would increase equity and influence everywhere. So that would be the idea of what we'd want to do, broadly speaking, right? Now, so let's look at Vancouver as an example, right? Here is the core city of Vancouver divided into 23 social planning neighborhoods, including the famous downtown east side, which is there. Here, the colors in the background are not the EDI vulnerability rates, but they're the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood. You can see the high to low from the green to the red. In each of these neighborhoods, though, there's a series of these little homunculi here, and each little guy represents 5 vulnerable kids, right? So you can see over here at the University Lands, on this wave of the data, we had 5, 10, 13 vulnerable kids out of that population. You can see over here, neighborhoods with much larger numbers of vulnerable kids and so forth, right? So that is the way in which the vulnerable children, as individuals, distributed themselves around town. Now let's double back. Let's say we were going to target. Well, following this example, our targeting would be by geography. We would target inner cityness, basically, right? The neighborhoods that are most inner city and have the highest vulnerability rates, right? And if we were to do that, and it were to work, success would look like this, right? We would have targeted some inner city areas, we would have done something successful, and the dots have moved down, right? That's what would have happened. But the problem is, the majority of vulnerable children would receive no benefit, right? So going back to the Vancouver example, it looks like this. Those are the 4 highest vulnerability, most inner city neighborhoods, right? And you can see the vulnerable children who would get picked up by that. You can count them out. But look at these here, right? Huge numbers of children growing up in lower middle class neighborhoods in particular, right? None of them getting benefits in the same way, right? Across these neighborhoods where the vulnerability rates are running from the low 20s to the mid 30s, something like that, let alone the more privileged areas. And for those of you who know about the Vancouver housing market, you know what that means. It's a disaster waiting to happen. So the point is, whether or not you target by geography, you target by nurse home visiting reports. You target by biological risk factor. You go for your favorite ethnic group. Whatever way you do it, you end up never getting more than about 15 or 20% of the vulnerable children, because most of them are spread across the broad middle class at a rate of 20 to 30%, right? So targeting has a problem here. Now, on the other hand, of course, everybody says, well, if we're not going to target, then we're going to do universal. The point is, we have to get the language right here, because a universal program means a program which is open to all. So the libraries are a universal program in that sense. Childcare is a universal program in the sense that, in principle, anybody can come. But a program for which, in principle, anybody can come does not mean that everybody uses it. And indeed, when things are known to be effective, over time, time in and time out, be it prenatal classes, be it summer camp, whatever, what happens is that those who are farther up the socioeconomic spectrum end up getting more of it than those who are further down, because there are various kinds of barriers of access that emerge at that end, which we'll talk about in the middle from the perspective of the child. So if you introduce something universal and it is effective, what will happen is things will go from that to that. That is to say, there's potential to be benefits right across the spectrum, but they will be disproportionately at this side, so that the level of social inequality will actually go up. And so you can see, as represented by the steepness of this line here, is steeper than that line there, right? So universal programs in and of themselves will tend to have that tendency. They will tend to increase the differences between people in different walks of life, if nothing else is done. So one of the things that's been coming up then is dealing with this issue of barriers of access. And now you can divide these in many different ways, but this is a list of 10 from the perspective of the child. So you can imagine there's a child here, and out there somewhere is something that could improve their development. You know, so some of these things, like program or service, you know, you have to drive 100 kilometers to get to it, or that it costs too much, are straight resource issues. But all the other 8 of these 10 are not. That many of them are things that can be handled by better planning, better community functioning better closer to home, as it were. Transportation. I mean, I know that public transportation is a huge challenge in this province, but, you know, creating, you know, custom transportation for families with young children is something to consider, of course. Time offered. Very large fraction of the population does not have any flexibility in its working hours, and so time gets in the way. Language that the program's offered in, probably more of an issue in Halifax than other places. Places like BC, this is an issue in a lot of places. Vancouver, you know, 65% of the kids start school with English as a second language, right? Huge issue. Fragmentation, that is to say that there isn't co-location, there isn't coordination between programs in terms of the times they're offered, in terms of who qualifies, the age, etc., etc. So if you have multiple kids, you're just in trouble pulling things around. Lack of information. Amazing how hard it is to communicate through to people on the existence of things, particularly in mass societies. Conflicting expectations between parents and providers in terms of what they want to provide, and no mechanism to handle that. Social distance. The care providers are different kinds of people from the families with children, and so there is social distance and distrust. And then finally, parental consciousness. There's nobody in the child's life who serves as a developmental advocate for them. So that is a kind of a list of potential barriers of access. And so going back to this notion of proportionate universality then, proportionate universality is about the idea of universal access at a scale and intensity that addresses barriers at every level. So it's sort of the merge of universal and targeting, but part of that merge is through thinking strategically about barriers that way. And if that works, then what you would expect would be you would get this. So you would get both benefits across the spectrum, but increasing disproportionate benefits at the higher vulnerability end of the spectrum. Now, this is not magic by any stretch of the imagination. And talking about proportionate universality does not suddenly make money appear that wasn't there before. But time and again, we've been seeing that when people start thinking about proportionate universality and starting conversations off with universal versus targeting, that possibilities emerge, right? And particularly, they emerge when you are working on a vertical partnership, as it were, so that the senior governments and funding agencies may be responsible for providing the resources, but there is strong local leadership that is dealing with a number of these barriers of access issues based on what's going on in the community, right? And yesterday at the presentation, Joanne raised a very good one about the idea that in some of the communities she's into, if you want to make things work, you want to do it at the Legion because people are more comfortable at the Legion than they are at the school or something like that. Well, that's a really important piece of local knowledge. I mean, just to give you a similar example, in Terrace, BC, a bunch of well-meaning people set up a program for families in the area, many of which are Aboriginal, and they put it in a place where Aboriginal children 40 or 50 years ago were taken before they were sent off to residential school. Guess who didn't go, right? So, you know, my point is then that this issue of the partnership is very, very important. In British Columbia, what's been happening is that we now have a network of 143 intersectoral coalitions to support children's development around the province. Even though the funding for them has never been that great, nonetheless, many of them function quite well. And now they've formed their own institute so that they learn from each other and all the rest of it. And so it's going to be interesting to see how similar things play out in this province. And, you know, particularly things like the experiment up in Inverness where they're setting up the Fraser Mustard Community Leadership Center as an example of, you know, local intersectorality with, you know, municipal leadership there. And I know that there are other examples around the province that exist, but the idea of trying to create an infrastructure like that is something that should be thought about very seriously in relation to your planning. And first and foremost, right from the beginning in BC, because the intersectoral coalitions co-evolved with doing the EDI, our primary clients for the EDI data and mapping were the intersectoral coalitions. They were the ones who took that stuff, looked it over and said, what's going on with physical development here? Why is there an east-west difference in it? We're going to do this, we're going to do that. That's the sort of thing that happened. Okay, now, yeah, I know this presentation is jumping around a little bit, but I do now want to step back and go back to that issue of our changing understandings of the nature of human development and biology. So at the deep end of the archaeology of biological embedding, we have something called social epigenesis and other processes that influence gene expression or function. So what the heck am I talking about here? I'm going to start with the butterfly story, and I know some of you know the butterfly story, but for those of you who don't, it's an interesting one. Anyway, here are two butterflies that live in sub-Saharan Africa. They live in the same area. As you can see, the one on the left is different color from the one on the right. It's smaller. It has a different shape of its body and different number of whatever these are, antennas sticking out. And it behaves differently. These ones here like to flit about and be delightful, whereas those ones like to sit in the dark and do not much of anything, right? So you may be asking why on 8 o'clock on a Wednesday evening do you have to hear a story about butterflies? And the reason is this, is because these butterflies are genetically the same butterfly. They are both Praecie octavia. The only difference is these were in the cocoon during the wet season, these were in the cocoon during the dry season. So that tells you something about the degree to which genes are not destiny. If you have identical genetic material, and until recently it was thought that these had to be two different species of butterflies that just lived together. They're not, they're the same. So what the heck's going on? What's going on is a process of epigenesis or epigenetics. And this is, epigenetics as it says here, refers to persistent and heritable, in other words, when cells divide, this will carry on. Alterations in genome information, in other words, the information carried in the DNA, that do not involve changes to the DNA sequence per se. So we're all aware of the idea that DNA can mutate over time and all the rest of it. We're not talking about mutations. What we're talking about is that there are 4 basic building blocks in the DNA. And one of those building blocks, called cytosine, it's possible to put a little molecule called a methyl group onto it. And when you do, it can change its function. And the way it works then is this. If you can imagine, there is a stretch of DNA, you know, the double helix we talked about, 4 different colored balls because the alphabet of DNA has evolved the 4 letters. And so what we've got there, in this piece here of the DNA, is what we would call a coding sequence, right? So a coding sequence is an area where RNA comes along and reads off the sequence, forms this messenger RNA through a transcription process, and then that is translated into proteins, and proteins do the work of the body, right? So proteins are the key thing here, right? So those are the workhorses, and we have about 20,000+ coding sequences in our DNA, right? In order for this to work, there is a sequence before the coding sequence that says, hold on, work is about to begin here, and another one that says stop, right? And what's important about that then is that out in front of this start thing, there is a thing called a promoter region. Now a promoter region is like a dimmer switch. So it is something that speaks to this, what's called RNA polymerase, which does this. And it says to it how active it needs to be. So if this dimmer switch is turned up bright, then RNA polymerase is going like the old Visa machines, you know? Like that. And it's pumping out the messenger RNA, which is pumping out the proteins. If the thing is turned down, then the amount of expression potentially goes down, right? So that's the way the system works. The new bit is that the social environment, as well as other things like nutrition, can in fact turn the dimmer switch up or down through this methyl group, this putting methyls on the cytosines in the promoter. So that's what's going on. And that's why those butterflies are different, because the nurturant conditions, the conditions of the wet versus the dry season in the cocoon, serve to turn certain genes up and down in different ways that produced an entirely different looking creature, right? So what's new about this is that it doesn't only occur during basic fetal development when, you know, blood cells becoming a blood cell and a bone cell's becoming a bone cell and a brain cell's becoming a brain cell, but it continues throughout pregnancy and afterbirth and can be influenced by the broader environment. So this is the sort of new thing that's come along, and we now have wonderful animal models in rice, in rats, in monkeys, and so forth there. But now we're doing studies in human populations, and in particular, what we've been doing is going back to those birth cohort studies that I talked about at the beginning of this, and identifying people several decades into life, collecting what tissue we can. We can't take brain cells, so we're working with white blood cells or buccal cells, things like that, and looking to see whether or not there is a signature of early experience in those things. And so, for instance, one case, we went back to the 1958 British birth cohort, which was all of the children born in the first week of March 1958 in England, Scotland, and Wales, that we've been following ever since. We got white blood cells at age 45 on a group of males in this case, divided up according to their socioeconomic position in childhood and adulthood. And then we looked at all 20,000 promoter regions to see whether or not the methylation patterns were different. And sure enough, among those that were in the top socioeconomic group in the first 7 years of their life had 1,252, or 6% of the promoter regions were methylated differently in that group than in the group at the other extreme of socioeconomic status, right? So think about this. White blood cells collected at 45 have a signature that was embedded on them, on their predecessors, 38 to 45 years earlier on, based on the social circumstances of kids growing up in post-war Britain, right? So we are talking about, on the one hand, the children of Cambridge, Oxford graduates, versus on the other hand, people who grew up with outdoor plumbing. We are talking about that kind of difference. And we did that on purpose to see whether we could find anything. And look what we find. Huge differences. One more example in another study where we, of children who've been very intensively studied, they're now teenagers in the United States. We looked at, this is a population where from birth through the first 18 months of life, they were asking the family about how they were doing every 3 months. So there was a huge amount of information on family stresses, particularly the mother's stresses during that first 18 months of life.
You know, did she feel depressed? Was she angry all the time? Were they fighting over parenting? Was there role overload? Were there financial stresses? Anyway, to make a long story short, 15 years later, we see a nice big signature on the buccal cells now of their offspring, associated with mothers' reported stress in the first 18 months of life, not fathers. Fathers' self-reported stress in the first 18 months of life had no signature. Mothers had. But between 18 months and school age, mother's signature starts to disappear and the signature in relation to the father starts to emerge. It's smaller, but it's there. So signatures that are very, very specific in terms of the nurturing roles that people have and so forth, right? So these are early days. There are 34 studies of this type going on in the literature right now, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that it has changed our notion of the nature of human beings, right? So that the old model was an idea that there's the DNA, it is the blueprint for your life. The blueprint determines the development of the child, which is the house, and then the environment weathers it. So this occurs first, and then the environment comes in. So it's a sort of an independent additive idea. Now what we've got is this kind of idea, where the blueprint does exist in a proto-form, but it's as though the family moves in while the blueprint is being implemented and alters it as it is going, so that the ultimate construction of the child, if you'd like, is based on an ongoing interaction between the social environment and the DNA. So the DNA is no longer the uncaused cause. It is part of a conversation that is happening with the world around it, right? And so as you can imagine, that makes so much of what we understand about the early years and sensitive periods and all the rest of it make a lot more biological sense than it ever meant before. Two more corollaries, I think, or a few more. I'm running out of time, aren't I?
Yeah, you can close.
I'm getting close, okay. I'll make a few more quick points, okay. Three points I want to make. One, social emotional development is the iceberg. Mental health problems are the tip. Across Canada right now, there is a lot of interest in mental health problems and you know, things like the kids committing suicide and all the rest of it. We have to understand that below that tip is a huge iceberg of the state of children's development in the social and emotional domains earlier on. So you can go back to our maps and you can break them down into individual scales. The social scale here and the emotional scale in a place like Winnipeg, and you can see the large differences in children's development. And then you can move forward in time, as we've been doing with our middle years tool, to start getting children to speak themselves about their sense of well-being and their assets. To make a long story short then, in population-based data we've generated, we've got this tool now that allows kids to talk about their well-being, but also to talk about the assets that they see being in their corner to help them thrive. So supportive adult relationships, positive peer relationships, think of bullying and so forth, nutrition and sleep, experiences at school, and after-school activities. To make a long story short, what we are discovering is that there is an incredibly strong association among these kids at age 10 between the assets they see available to them and their sense of well-being. So where it says 0 here, these are the kids who are not reporting strength in any of those 5 asset classes I showed you. Only 11% of them on the well-being side ended up reporting things that put them in the moderately high well-being. Among those kids who could identify strength in one asset class, it goes up to 30%, and about 1/3 are high and 2/3 are moderately high well-being. Kids who identify 2 asset classes, 40% in the high to moderately high and half. 3 asset classes, nearly 60% and more in the high than the moderate. 4 asset classes, 77%. 5 asset classes, 87%, where the majority of those kids are reporting high levels of well-being. So a very, very strong relationship between assets and well-being. And when you lay it out geographically then across the city, in the background, the dark blue are the high socioeconomic, moderate, and low socioeconomic areas, and in the foreground, the puzzle piece represents 4 of those 5 asset classes, and when they're dark, that means it's high, and when they're light, it means they're low. So you can see we've got areas where on average the kids are reporting high assets and everything, other areas where the kids are reporting low assets and everything. And remember, these were the areas which have the largest number of vulnerable kids, not the highest rate, but the largest number. We can actually see, though, in the downtown east side and Mount Pleasant, we can see the impact of targeting. See, that's the after-school programs thing, right? So we're seeing that where the after-school activities are being provided for inner city children, they're being taken up. We can see that from this. We need to build and monitor developmental trajectories. So we need to be looking at children from birth onward and understanding the way they're developing. When you do that, a variety of very interesting things come about. One is, and this is where we've linked the EDI data to school records, you can show the strength of the early years influencing what's going on in school. So this represents an entire wave of BC children, 40,000 kids. Along here, what they were like on the EDIs. 0 means not vulnerable on any scale of the EDI, then 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 vulnerabilities. And then the bars show how they did 4 years later on the standardized math and reading tests. The main thing that you can see here is this, that as you go from 0 vulnerabilities to 1, to 2, to 3, to 4, to 5, the fraction of kids who fail to meet expectations on these tests, who fail it basically, goes up from 20% up to over 80% at that end. And as a result of data like this, it's possible then to model out what would happen if we dropped vulnerability rates. So if we start at 29% vulnerability rate, in BC anyway, that's associated with 41.5% of kids graduating at the other end with university eligible grades, if we want to use that as a kind of a standard of competence. If we drop vulnerability to 15%, that goes up to 50%, and if we drop vulnerability to 10%, that goes up to nearly 56%. So bringing vulnerability down to where we think we can would increase the fraction of kids reaching that level of competence by 34%. And that turns into, it turns out, improving the rate of growth of the economy by 1% for every 1% we reduce the vulnerability rate. And it turns out to be a huge amount. Here in Nova Scotia, if the numbers played out here the way they do in BC, it would be like being handed $100 billion in a bank account now, generating 5% interest for the next 60 years. So it's considerable. Another linkage one, this is, actually I'm not going to bother with this. Let me just go to the end. Final point is that Canada is underinvesting in the early years. We are, among the wealthy countries of the world, the lowest investor as a proportion of our gross domestic product in early childhood education and care. That is to say, all of those things that are analogous to school. I'm not talking about pediatrics. I'm talking about the things that are analogous to supporting families and children in the developmental stages. We spend about 1/4% of our GDP on this. The average across the OECD is 3 times as high at 0.7%, and the UNICEF and EU benchmark, European Union benchmark, is 1%. And you can see there's a bunch of countries that are out there. And indeed, what we know is that, and this is an area where you get what you pay for. These countries up here that are spending 1.5 to 2% of their GDP are doing virtually all of the 10 benchmark things that are said to be important around family policy, whereas Canada is tied for last with Ireland doing only one of them. Whereas, as it points out here, over 55% of Canadians don't know or don't believe that Canada ranks poorly in investing in families with young children, which is quite shocking. So thank you very much for listening.